Before COVID, the dealer network was losing money. In fact, a third were unprofitable, and the net profit to sales was less than 1%. Fast forward through the pandemic, and we've gone through an undersupply situation, but supply is returning. Is it going to go back to the old days, or has the industry learned something new? We speak to James Voortman from the AADA, who comes to us fresh from his visit to the NADA conference in North America. Let's hear what he has to say.
With 30 years experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies and original equipment manufacturers. Please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
James, thanks very much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show. You've just spent time in the US at NADA. Can you maybe share with us some of the outcomes and what you found were the main things coming out of NADA?
Thanks John and Mark for having me. And we just got back. We went to AADA, which this year was in Dallas, in Texas. The first time it's been there in some time. And AADA takes a study tour every year. And we went primarily for the NADA show, as they call it. 25,000 delegates, many exhibitors. A real sort of impressive show if you're in the business of automotive retail, new car automotive retail. So it's always a good experience going there. But I think what was really interesting this time was the first time we were able to go back since the COVID pandemic. The last time we were there was in February 2020, and I was actually in Las Vegas at the show when we got the announcement on Holden withdrawing from Australia. So a lot of memories. Shot back to Australia, started working with the Holden members to manage the fallout from that announcement. And not long after that, we were in a pandemic, and that pandemic meant we could not go back to NADA until we did a few months ago in January/February. So it's good that we could get back there. But what the benefit of that gap gave us was to see how quickly some of the themes that they were discussing as an industry had changed. When we went there last time, there was talk about electric vehicles, but I must say in the US, the talk was more restrained. They were saying that they'd love to sell electric vehicles, but that there were still issues with the cost, with the choice of vehicle, with charging infrastructure. A lot more buoyant this time, and you saw it from a lot of the dealers. You also saw it from a lot of the suppliers. People are really starting to think about this. It's being driven by a lot of government, investment in trying to encourage the uptake. Phenomenal investment in the US at the moment. There's also brands who are going there through their own investment and are asking their dealers to get on board. And some of that's been controversial, but nonetheless, it was a key theme. The other key theme at NADA we picked up, and this was in our dealings with the dealers, the international dealers, but also the staff from NADA, my equivalents, and there were also a number of other associations from around the world, Europe, Canada, South America, and the like. And I think if we had asked all of those associations what they thought about the agency model in early 2020, not many of them had heard about it. And particularly the Americans were not at all concerned about it because of the franchising laws that exist in the United States. This time, everyone knew what it was. They'd all been looking to Australia as an example. It's all something that is now emerging in markets, some markets more than others. So it's really become a real talking point in Europe. In America, it's starting to emerge as a big talking point, particularly with some of the things Ford are doing. So I think that there's been a big shift there, and distribution as a theme was one of the big talking points. Obviously, supply, questions about supply, when it would come back, how the industry would or should be responding when it comes back. That was a key part of it. So those were some of the key themes. I would say very interestingly, I mentioned the overseas associations, and a lot of the dealers we took on the study tour said the same thing. It does seem like Australia is at the forefront of some of the trends in the automotive industry. And I say that because we were one of the first on agency. We seem to be leading the way with the emergence of Chinese brands. We're certainly ahead of some of our other like-minded markets. And then another one, the United States in particular, is starting to experience some of that intervention in the F&I market that we experienced over the last 4 or 5 years. So I thought that was really interesting. They're learning from us as much as we're learning from them. Look, that's probably just a handful of the very key themes that I identified at NADA.
And James, what did
What was the general vibe in the industry with all the people, the different players that were at the conference?
Yeah, Mark, look, from a dealer's perspective, very positive. Profitability was good. A lot of them said they could do with a bit more supply, but generally positive, but also cognizant of some of those challenges that lay ahead, concerns of what was to come. And they're looking at this from, some of them are looking at it from an electric vehicle perspective. We were obviously in Dallas, and I would always say that there's almost this two-speed situation developing in the United States. You have the Californias of this world, which are heavily urbanized cities in California, all turning towards electric vehicles very quickly. When I got out of the airport in Dallas, we drove to a hotel, and the amount of very large pickup trucks was a sight to behold. That's something that does affect dealers in that particular state and in many other states. We actually took the tour group to a Ford dealership about an hour outside of Dallas, Southwest Ford, and we were hosted to a fantastic day. This dealership showed us around their facilities. They put on a barbecue for us. It was great. This particular dealer said that 80% of his sales were truck sales, and that hadn't changed for some time, even in the face of very generous federal government incentives. They had one F-150 Lightning on show. I think he said he'd only sold one other. There was an electric, one of the new electric Mustangs, people not sort of knocking down the doors to get that. So that was what we saw in that particular area. But, the vibe was also very cognizant of what the federal government there is doing. And I spoke earlier about some of the incentives that are at play, really big money. There are incentives for new electric vehicles, I think to the tune of $7,500 US dollars. There were incentives for used cars being discussed, which some of the dealer groups were a bit skeptical about, thinking that it would just drive up prices in the used market. There are even incentives for truck businesses to purchase electric trucks to the tune of, and I forget whether it was $40,000 or $60,000, but a lot of money being thrown. Wow. The Biden government really is, through its Inflation Reduction Act, really trying to be at the forefront of this boom. Some of it's through incentivization. Some of it's through trying to disrupt the gains that China have made in the battery technology. But that was the big, sort of issue a lot of people were talking about. And, conscious about how this electrification drive will affect their dealership. And in particular, we heard from some of the Ford dealers who had been in discussions around some of the investment requirements to become an electric vehicle dealer. And there were big numbers being discussed. It's not only big numbers for the charging technology, there are investments that need to be made so that your service department is fit for purpose to handle those vehicles. If the charging technology requires a substation, that's another element. So there was a lot of discussion around electrification. And linked to that, in the Ford example, is this discussion around agency. Now, about a year or so ago, the CEO of Ford in the US outlined a strategy whereby he'd separate the traditional ICE company from the electric vehicle side of the business. He expressed the desire to sell those electric vehicles at a fixed price, more and more online. There'd be very brutal, as he called it, investment requirements. So when you're hearing about things like fixed price and so on, it doesn't take long for those dealers in the US to talk agency. So those are some of the other headwinds. And then just the general economy. Like us, they're struggling with high inflation, higher interest rates. And what does that do to consumer confidence? It seems to be holding up a little for the time being, but obviously something dealers are watching closely.
James, you mentioned supply. How quick do you think that supply will come back? Because we've heard a lot of debating here. Is it 6 months or 18 months or longer than that? What's your view from what you learned at AADA?
I guess there's the question of when will supply return globally and when will Australia have supply return. I think the general message we were getting from most OEMs, quite a cautious one. I think a lot of them were burnt in the early years of this crisis, over-promising. So I think they've been quite cautious in their forecasting. But we're still hearing that it's probably going to be with us for most of this year and that we're hoping for resolution as they call it, by the end of 23, early 24. Of course, here in Australia, we've thought that we got a handle on it. We're now seeing some biosecurity issues emerge at the ports. So it's a pretty brutal situation for those customers who've been waiting for a long time. We've always had biosecurity as a consideration in our supply chain, but on this occasion, what we're hearing is there is a significant build-up. How long that goes on for, how long it sort of stops us from getting back to a supply situation we saw before COVID, that remains to be seen.
James, and what would your advice be for dealers? What should their takeaway be from the learnings of AADA?
The view we had is that electric vehicles are coming, and this is something we tell the government. We don't doubt that they're coming. The investment that manufacturers are putting into this technology just means that they will be coming. But there is still a question about how quickly they come. Those questions, I think, stem from partly whether we can sort of bring the cost of the batteries down quick enough, whether we can supply reliable chargers and enough of them in a public sense. But then there are also larger questions. We've just discussed supply, John. Well, supply that we've been experiencing around the semiconductor crisis is one thing, but there are also questions about whether we're going to be able to supply enough batteries to satisfy global demand. And that's because electric vehicles not only need more semiconductors than traditional ICE cars, they also have critical minerals in their batteries, critical minerals like lithium, cobalt. There's a range of minerals that they need. And the question of whether we can just ramp up the mining required to build those batteries is a real one. So I think that they are coming. That's a lesson from AADA. We just don't know how quickly they will be here. And I think especially in the Australian context, what I saw in the US is I saw a government that's throwing $400 billion at trying to incentivize all sorts of renewable energy technologies. Over here, we don't have that kind of incentive. We see some states giving 3,000 Australian dollars to electric vehicle buyers, but we don't have some of the other tools that those governments have, like fuel efficiency standards. It'll be interesting to see if Australia does struggle a little bit to get their hands on some of that EV supply. We're obviously seeing it at the moment with some brands who supply electric vehicles in certain markets, but not on ours. The other take home I got from NADA is that agency is firmly on the agenda for some OEMs, not all, and that's even in the United States. So spoke about Ford a little bit earlier. That's probably the most prominent. In Europe, I'd say they've moved ahead of Australia in terms of some of the people looking at agency. We have Stellantis saying that they're going there. Mercedes have just started going there. The VW Group and its associated brands are keen on agency. So, it's something that's still very much on their agenda. There are regulatory obstacles in the EU and in some states in the United States. So we'll be watching those very closely, but it's something that is still being considered and looked at, and that's being driven by some of the gains Tesla have made in the global industry. Another take-home, I'd say, from NADA is China, the rise of Chinese brands. Here in Australia, we are ahead of some of the other Western markets, and I guess that trend's only set to continue. I think Chery's going to start selling vehicles any day now in Australia. My question is not whether they're coming, they're here. I think they were 15% of the market in February. They became our third biggest country of origin. So what does that mean for competition in Australia? And what does it mean for our market when supply does normalise? Those are some of the questions I'd be asking.
James, where do you see the future of the industry as a whole, and how do you think it's going to impact OEMs and dealers? Because it's almost like there's would you say it's a comfortable marriage at the moment, or is it one that sort of they want to go see other people? Is this where we're sort of looking at this situation and just the industry as a whole?
Yeah, look, a good question. Quick comment. I like your analogy of a marriage. We have some great marriages in the Australian automotive industry. We have some sort of not so great marriages which have their challenges, but the respective spouses are working hard to overcome those challenges. Then we frankly have situations which have ended up in acrimonious divorce.
Yes.
So I think when we talk about where we are with OEMs, it really is important to acknowledge that there are really good relationships. in this market. And what we always say is look at those really good marriages. They're characterized by respectful relationships. When changes are made, change is conducted in a consultative, respectful manner. We often say that some of those brands that are in good relations with their dealers have had long, continuous management. We haven't seen 3 or 4 CEOs over the space of 5 years. It's often managing directors or CEOs who've been in place for almost a decade or longer, and there's always a succession plan in place. Yes, look, there are different strands to all of this, but what I would say is clearly manufacturers are coming at this from them wanting to make certain changes to the industry, because it's a competitive industry and they're seeing new entrants emerge who they think are putting them under pressure. So obviously there is the temptation to look at the dealer model and try and revamp it. And we have always said as an association that we are not opposed to change. Manufacturers have the right to change their distribution model if they really do think it's the right way to go. All we've said is you have to be transparent with your dealers and tell them exactly what you're looking to do and give them plenty of notice about any impending changes. And where appropriate, you need to compensate them for all the investments they've made, all the time they've put into the brand, and all those customers they've brought to the brand. That's what I'd say on the relations between dealers and manufacturers. What does the future look like? Going into COVID, we thought we were one of the most competitive markets in the world. Yes, we've lost a pretty iconic brand in the process, but the reality is we're even more competitive. And I'm not only talking about the emergence of these Chinese brands. Think about the Cupras coming into this market. Think about the Grenadier brand coming into this market. Australia is still seen as a place where many brands want to be and sort of do come. And it's not becoming less competitive. It's becoming more competitive. The future, I think the question of supply is I have started to ask whether supply is going to be a structural thing. It will be interesting with more players, but as there is this move to electrified vehicles, will this become more of a structural thing? Will we have build to order become the norm in this industry rather than the outlier? Well, the future of dealers and OEMs will be characterized by the need to invest. It'll probably be a bit different for dealers. I'm hoping we won't still be asked to regularly build freshly minted glass showrooms, but we're kidding ourselves if we don't think there will be requests for investment in new things like charging infrastructure, and other investments which will make the dealerships ready for electric vehicles. OEMs also going to have to invest, obviously in the product if they want to electrify, but also a lot of them who want to take on the responsibilities that dealers have generally taken on, they're also going to be asked to invest if that's the path they want to go down. So look, that's probably where they are. There'll be a number of other future trends that I haven't sort of identified. COVID has put a brake on that margin erosion that we're experiencing. But with all the pressure and all the competition, I think margin erosion is likely to become a feature again at some stage, and it'll be interesting to see how the industry addresses that as a collective.
James, before COVID, you saw a lot of dealerships amalgamating and starting to try and grow bigger.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a trend that needs to continue in the future? Do dealers need to get bigger to survive?
Yeah, look, I think that COVID's definitely put a brake on that rationalisation process, and it's because of that last point I mentioned. There was this really clear trend of margin compression in our industry, and COVID basically, came as a life raft. 2019, I remember the numbers, 0.9% return on sales, 1/3 of dealers not making any money at all. They're struggling to adapt to the changes that were made to the finance side of the business. The industry is just oversupplied. It was oversupplied and it was a race to the bottom, and we were very close to hitting rock bottom, and COVID was a life raft. So I think it brought profitability back in for everyone. We're probably kidding ourselves if we don't think that the future is still one of scale. I think that OEMs are going to continuously, sort of look to compete with the new entrants into this market. They're going to be focused on their own margins. and they're probably going to look at their dealer network as a potential solution to that. So I think it's coming back. I think scale will be important. Scale will be important for some of those investments we talk about around electric vehicles, and we're probably seeing a lot of the bigger groups get onto that right now, already right-sizing their sites for that kind of investment that's going to be required and those installations that are going to be required. That's where I think it is. The question is, do we have another few years whereby supply constraints sort of slow down that rationalization process? I don't know. It's interesting because probably not the worst time in the world to sell up and get out, where with values being where they are, but the temptation will always be to hang on a little longer.
And James, what are the key focus areas over the next 18 months for the AADA?
Geez, how long have you got, Mark?
This is the mission statement and the business plan.
So look, we've spoken about a lot of industry dynamics. Obviously, my main goal is to advocate for the industry, and a lot of that work is done with government. So if you talk about a lot of the issues we've been talking about here, I guess I'll put a government spin on a lot of them in my day-to-day job. So for electric vehicles, it's going to be a big period of time working with the government. The new Labor government that was elected last year has made it very clear that they have more ambitious emission reduction goals. So they've already outlined a number of ways in which they're going to both introduce a carrot and stick approach to vehicle emissions. And the carrot approach we're already seeing through things like, as I said, state-based incentives, but also fringe benefit tax concessions on electric vehicles. So that's the carrot approach, and there might be more of that to come. But then there's also going to be a stick approach, and that's going to be a thing called a fuel efficiency standard, which, frankly speaking, most industrialized countries have got. Some of them have had them for some time, and Australia has.
Is that the CAFE rules that the US have, for example?
Yeah, that's right. That's the CAFE rules that the US have. The European Union has something very similar, and so do markets like Japan and elsewhere. Australia does not have those standards. It's been a very difficult thing for governments from both sides to try and introduce. The first attempt at this happened back in, I think, 2011. The government at that stage walked away from it because of they didn't want to undermine local manufacturing. And then, there was another attempt at it about 5 years ago, which fell flat. But we're at a position now where the government is proposing it, and the industry is actually supportive of it. The OEMs are asking for this because here in Australia, they think it's the only way they're going to get the factories abroad to send them some of the better product. So it's a highly technical bit of legislation that we'll start consulting on probably in a matter of weeks. We'll be working very closely with the manufacturers, but also many other industry participants, because we all agree that we need one of these fuel efficiency standards. But it's also important is that it is a fit-for-purpose standard that takes account of Australia as a small right-hand drive market that's located many, many miles away from manufacturing centres. It's important that we have something ambitious which brings down emissions and saves fuel for Australians. But it's also important that we have something achievable which doesn't erode affordability of product, doesn't erode vehicle choice, and doesn't sort of harm businesses which have made massive investments in the industry. So that's probably number one on the agenda, not only for the AADA, but for the industry. The second big thing, which is no surprise, this has been something we've probably prioritised for the last 3 or 4 years, is franchising law and franchising law reform. At the moment, I think it's fair to say the whole industry is watching a certain court case, which is due, the judge in that case in the Mercedes-Benz trial is due to hand down his verdict in the coming, weeks or months. So I think we're all watching that. We're also all watching overseas markets like Europe and the US and see how their regulators are dealing with agency, because there are some real questions around agency models, particularly in Europe. There's this whole concept of if you are going to have an agency model, the OEM should be taking on all of the risk. And the question is whether those OEMs are calling it agency, but sometimes still putting some risk onto the agent or the dealer. Those are parts of the franchising laws we're looking at. It's obviously something we benefited from getting better protections in this market in July of 2021. Those protections are steadily being rolled out. Obviously, we're still getting feedback as to how they're working, but we're in constant communication with dealers, particularly those who are signing new agreements. Consumer affairs is a big issue in a regulatory sense and has been for the past 4 or 5 years. We got a couple of government reports out there awaiting response from the government, one being a report that was done by the Productivity Commission. Now, that's got a number of recommendations that we've taken an interest in, including what's called a new super complaints regime, which will allow consumer groups to make super complaints on behalf of a class of consumer. There's another recommendation that some products should come with what's called a durability rating. I would argue that in the automotive industry, with the long warranties that we have, is we shouldn't be one of those industries subject to a durability rating, but that's besides the point. And then there's also some suggestion that we need what's called a consumer ombudsman in the various states and territories. Again, that's something we'd push back against, because we believe the problem, if there is a problem with consumers having their cases heard, is with the staffing and the resourcing of existing tribunals at that level. There's some interesting things happening around taxation. Unfortunately, we're not getting a sense that the luxury car tax is on the cards of this current government. They have moved slightly on EV taxation, as I spoke about earlier, with the fringe benefits tax and the tariffs being taken off for electric cars. More interesting is a court case before the federal court in Victoria around whether the Victorian government has the right to charge electric vehicles per kilometre that they drive. That's a case that's been brought forward by consumers, but the Commonwealth's actually sided with the consumers against the Victorian government, and that case will have repercussions for what state governments can actually tax on, and how they can tax people for the use of vehicles. So that's something we're watching very closely. Obviously, the skills crisis in our industry is something that's keeping a lot of our members awake at night, and they're passing those concerns on to us and to other industry associations. So that's something, again, the whole industry is really trying to remedy, and we need to fix it, especially in our service departments. There's probably a role government can play in terms of helping us with better training regimes, better ability to bring in migrants. There's stuff dealers can do in terms of making the dealerships better places to work and more inclusive. There's also things the OEMs can do, and I'm thinking of things like cap price servicing, which often means that we can't pass those costs on to consumers, but we're still wearing the wage inflation that we're seeing in the industry. So I think that's something that, a lot of parties are going to have to address together. The other thing that we've sort of been dealing with for the past, I think it's almost a year, is the new information sharing regime. This is the regime which has now compels manufacturers to share repair and service information with the independent repair sector. We're part of a board called ASRA, which is helping administer the sharing of that information. So, it's early days, but that's another industry-wide consultative group that we're part of. And then finally, I guess, finance and insurance. We don't have any pressing government interventions at the moment, but we expect they can come at any moment. So it's something we always watch. We're getting feedback on in advance of any of those approaches being made by government. So I'm sure I've forgotten a lot of stuff.
That's a very impressive list.
Well, it's the cut down version, Mark. There's a lot more, and there's also a lot more work we do these days with state governments. I don't know if you noticed, but after COVID, state governments became pretty emboldened, and
yes.
That applies to the automotive industry too, where they've gone ahead of the feds in terms of incentivizing electric vehicles. Some of them have developed luxury duties that they're applying, and I think we'd be wise to engage with them. We saw a proposal in New South Wales recently in which they were trying to revamp dealer licensing laws, and one of the proposals was around banning of used cars online. So that was something we managed to work with them and others on to get changed. But I guess the point is here, like so many others, we're seeing that many governments are affecting our industry, and we have to deal with them all.
James, and conferences, are you planning a AADA conference this year?
Yes, we are. That's an excellent question, John. So we're locked in for the 14th and 15th of June in Sydney at the International Convention Centre. We've only just started marketing the event. You can go on to the website for the convention, aadaconvention.com.au. If you go on there, there's a website where you can register, you can make inquiries. The theme This year is going to be Retail Auto, the road ahead. And we've got some very exciting speakers that we will be announcing in the coming weeks and months ahead. But as usual, it'll be a brilliant sort of celebration of the industry and all the people involved in it. What I would say about NADA, what we had on that study tour was a lot more involvement from OEMs, and we're looking to involve them more at our convention in June. We really want this to be an industry in which we work together as much as we can. We won't always agree on everything, but as long as we keep talking, we're in a good space but we probably agree on more than we disagree on. Yeah, I'd like to see the both of you in Sydney as well as all of your viewers. So 14 and 15 June.
Sounds great. I'm just thinking James has got one hell of a big list of things on his to-do list.
Well, we're lucky. We've got such a good team here that I just read the list. Everyone else goes and works on those individual items. So, very lucky. We've got a great team, and we've got amazing members who help direct us as to what we should be saying and so forth.
Because just when you were going through the list, I was basically thinking in my head, there's a podcast on every one of those subjects.
There really is,
Everyone, there's a deep dive and there's, okay, so what's the current state? What's the future state? What are the challenges and what are the actions? And it's amazing when you just went through it. I was just, the wheels were grinding in my head because probably a lack of lubrication there as the gears were meshing. But I was thinking, that's incredible. It's just the technician one is a huge one. And especially now that we're pivoting out of ICE, but we still need the ICE technology and know-how because there's still going to be ICE vehicles crossing over. So you suddenly now have a shortage of people with the current state, but then the future state, it's going to get even harder because the need or the knowledge requirement is so much broader. And you'll have people exiting the industry that'll say, oh, I just can't handle these new EVs. I'm an ICE person. And then you'll have those that come in saying, well, EVs excite me, but I don't really like the idea of these ICE things. They don't make sense to me.
Yeah.
So there will almost be a chameleon, if you like, that's the mid-range person who is a current state ICER, but then is adopting EV.
Yeah, look, and I was in the UK last year, and I went to a Kia dealership who were heavy electric vehicle dealers, and their one master technician, probably their most experienced technician, just said, I refuse to work on electric vehicles. I don't want to. I suspect he's going to be emblematic of a lot of people in the industry, especially those coming to the end of their careers, just saying, look, I don't need to learn a whole new skill set. Let me stick with what I know. But you know what? It's also an opportunity, Mark, because some of the research we've done in some of the apprentice work we've done, I think shows that people are excited by these new technologies, and that might be an opportunity for us to get more people into our industry. So yeah, you're right though. There's going to be a sort of a hybrid solution for some time.
So there'll be the guy that wants the old school performance, which is camshafts and carburetors and high compression engines, and then the alternative is the plug in a laptop, dial up the amount of current and the RPM limitations on the electric motors, and away we go.
And then there'll probably be, there might be. When we were in the UK, we were told about one of the brands who, if the battery in the vehicle was experiencing what they called, I think, a critical danger, they'd have to take it to a complete exclusion zone, and then they'd have to get someone trained in the safety, and so forth, to come in with a hazmat suit or whatever and work on this. So, it's going to be, I think it's going to be interesting to see how we transition that part of the business.
That is incredible. Just all those little elements that kick in. And I like the way you even said F&I was the last on the list. And yet we know if the government plays with F&I, that has massive ramifications for A, dealer profitability, but B, the ability for customers to actually buy a vehicle and access to credit. A credit squeeze is something that really hurts the industry at a macro level.
There's that period, just ahead and during the Royal Commission in which customers really were struggling to get credit. And it was at that time that a lot of changes were being made in this industry. And fast forward now where, the cost of credit is that much higher. I think governments are probably wise to really consider what, if any, interventions they make in this space, because, the many interventions they made over the past 5 years, some required, some were, fair enough. I think they were well within their rights to change some of the practices that were occurring. But I think it's important to consider every practice on its merits, understand who's going to be affected. And when I say who, I'm not only meaning the dealer, the customer too, because often all of this regulatory intervention does have a cost, and that cost gets passed on. It is a multifaceted sort of job. We're lucky. A lot of the stuff we do work on, we don't always talk about much because we like to prioritise some of the key policy issues. But there's so many other things. Data's another one I didn't mention. That's probably linked to the franchising relationship to some extent, but then there's also the privacy element. We've seen the Optus hack and so forth. That's another big issue. So there are automotive issues, and then there are other issues which affect all businesses, and we're involved with some of those. There's a wage review on at the moment that the Fair Work Commission will be considering. Again, that's going to have implications for our industry. Industrial relations changes made earlier this year. We're a country that where businesses are always looking over their shoulder and seeing whether there's any forced regulatory change. So yeah, it's big work.
Thanks very much for a fascinating discussion. It's been really interesting.
Thanks, gents. Thanks for having me.
A great discussion with James Voortman from the AADA. Interesting topics as far as agency, EV adoption, technology, technician shortages, and the like.
If you enjoyed what you heard, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, Spotify, and LinkedIn.